Hello, I'm DevPoodle. A new major version of Godot was just released, Godot 4.5. This update includes a bunch of optimizations, quality of life improvements, and new features. Today I'll show you some of my favorite new stuff, how to use them, and hopefully inspire you to play around with the update yourself. Let's start off with my personal favorite feature, Stencil Buffers. A stencil buffer is a specialized type of texture. If you've ever used a mask layer in a program like Photoshop or Krita, it's kind of like that. Here's an example. On the left, we have our stencil buffer. It's purposefully very low resolution in this demonstration so that I can display the individual numbers in the buffer. By default, it's all initialized to 0. Let's draw this triangle onto the screen. We can choose to set the values of the pixels covered by that triangle from any number between 0 and 255. Let's set them equal to 1. When we draw the triangle, it renders to the screen and to the stencil buffer with the value we picked. Then, when we draw another shape, like this square, we can compare it to the values already in the stencil buffer, and use that to decide whether a pixel should be rendered. For example, let's say we only want to draw the square where the stencil buffer equals 1. This results in the square only drawing where it overlaps with the triangle. These would be the corresponding shaders for the triangle and square in Godot's shading language. All interactions with the stencil buffer are confined to the new stencil mode keyword and the various modes you can put after it. Stencil buffers can be used to create dozens of different effects. The most popular example would have to be portals. Here's a little test scene I made. Through this portal, I can see a separate scene with a red cube in it. If I look around, you can see it's all just an illusion. There's nothing there. In fact, I actually see a green cube if I look at it the other way. Something like this is now very simple with stencil buffers. First, I render this rectangular mesh instance that sets a 1 to the stencil buffer. If I use this stencil viewer node I made, you can actually see what values are in the buffer. Let's turn that off for now. I'm then rendering an entirely separate scene under the sub viewport node. Finally, I draw the sub viewport texture over the entire screen with this shader, which only renders where the stencil buffer equals 1. To make it look properly 3D, I'm then making the camera in the sub scene match the transform of the main camera. This is what the corresponding script looks like, in case you want to create this effect yourself. A simpler use case would be the silhouette effect you see in most modern third-person games like Mario Odyssey. In these, the main character's mesh sets the value to the stencil buffer only where the character is covered by another object, which you can do in Godot with the right depth veil mode. You can then draw a basic pattern texture over the whole screen using the stencil buffer as a mask. Here's what the shader looks like. Alright, next feature. This is technically two features, but they're closely related. Abstract classes and abstract functions. Abstract classes are classes that can't be instantiated on their own. Basically, if you want to use an abstract class, you need to first create a class that overrides it. Abstract functions are functions that have to be overridden by child classes. In most Godot projects, you'll typically have some very generic base classes, like this enemy class. On its own, it doesn't have much functionality, and so it wouldn't make much sense to instantiate this as it is. By using the abstract keyword before the class name, you can guarantee that the user of the class won't do that by accident. If we look at the functions of the class, they're also quite bare bones. While the take damage function is fine on its own, we'd expect every single enemy to implement the die function separately. By writing abstract before this function, we can again guarantee that this class will be used the way we expect. In general, the abstract keyword enforces a specific way of using a class, which can help prevent bugs before they're even written. This bat class inherits the enemy class. We don't have to override the take damage function. We can if we want to, no errors pop up, but it's not necessary. We do, however, have to override the die function. If we comment it out, an error pops up telling us to implement it. Next feature. There were a lot of quality of life features introduced in 4.5. Instead of picking just one, I'll quickly go through the ones that I personally find the most useful. Mute game toggle. When running your game in editor, there's now a mute game button at the top. When I'm not specifically working on sound effects or music, I generally prefer to keep my projects on mute. This makes that a bit more convenient. Script color picker. When you have a color defined in your script, you'll now see a little indicator next to the color, showing you what it looks like. When you click this indicator, it pops up Godot's default color picker, letting you manually adjust it. Tile map chunking. Now tile maps collision shapes are automatically merged into bigger groups. Before, collisions would look like this, with one individual collision shape per tile. Now they look something like this, where the engine attempts to merge the shapes of nearby tiles. This isn't technically just a quality of life change, because it also improves performance, but I'm putting it here because it's a feature I was looking forward to for quite a while. Append to signal source. When binding a new signal, you have this Append to signal source checkbox. When you check it and create the signal's color will be added to the end of the argument list automatically, letting you use the node in your function. So that's the quality of life stuff done. The next feature I want to talk about is stacked label effects. When using a label node, you get access to this label settings resource that lets you change things like the font size, outline, and drop shadow. As of 4.5, there's new options for stacked outlines and stacked shadows. Each of these allow for custom sizes and colors. You could recreate this sort of effect in earlier versions by stacking multiple label nodes on top of each other, but that's much less convenient. This is a feature I personally have had a lot of fun with. I like having alternate white and black outlines to create high contrast text and icons. I also love animating outlines. Like, look at this. This effect works by increasing and then decreasing the size of each outline, and then once an outline layer gets to the end, moving it back to the first part of the array. This is probably one of the least optimal ways of implementing this sort of animating effect, but it was really easy to code, and I think it'll probably pop up now and then in some of my future videos. The final feature to talk about is shader baking. This feature actually has quite a history. A big problem in modern games is shader compilation. Whenever you write a shader, it has to get turned into code the GPU can actually run. That's one of the reasons why a lot of games nowadays have these really long loading screens when you start them up. It's typically better to get the shader compilation out of the way at the start of the game, rather than hit the player with a bunch of random stutters throughout. Godot didn't really have a system for this before version 4.4. In that update, they added Uber shaders. These were shaders the engine could fall back on while another shader is busy compiling. They reduced stutter, but they only really worked for the engine's default shaders, and were more of a band-aid on the problem than a full solution. Well, 4.5 finally introduced that solution, shader baking. In export settings, you can now choose to enable shader baking. What this will do is at the start of the project, it scans through all of the shaders in your game and pre-compiles them for the user's device. In most cases, this will completely solve in-game lag caused by shader compilation. This was a very commonly complained about issue in previous versions. I mean, look at all these people asking for workarounds for it, but now it's finally solved. So that's all the features I wanted to go over. I hope this inspired you to work on your own projects and try out the new update. The link to the Godot blog post that goes over all these features, and way more, is linked in the description. If this helped you out, feel free to like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. I do greatly appreciate feedback or suggestions for future videos that you may have. I'm DevPoodle, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye!